The story of the Tudors is mostly remembered starting with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and the merging of the houses of York and Lancaster. But if we look back just 2 generations, a decision made by Catherine of Valois makes her the grandmother of the House of Tudor. Catherine married Owen Tudor in her second marriage, and through this the line of Tudor was born. Catherine had what one would call a roller coaster of a life, from a neglected child to a royal bride and then a widow. Her second marriage turned heads, and her death was then the beginning of a very long, brutal and barbaric afterlife. But what is her story, and why was her life and then death such a whirlwind? Catherine of Valois was a French princess born in the October of 1401, and through her marriage to Henry V of England she became queen. This marriage was part of a plan to help unite England and France, with the aim of placing Henry V as King of England and France. It's believed this was in order to try and end the 100 Years' War. But even though Catherine and Henry's son, Henry VI, was crowned in Paris, the war continued. It was actually the second marriage of Catherine to Owen Tudor that led to her family's rise in fortune. Sir Owen Tudor managed to push the House of Tudor to a high rise, and it was their grandson, Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who then became King of England. But Catherine's life started much earlier. She was born in 1401 and was the youngest daughter of King Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria. Now sadly it is believed, but debated by historians, that Catherine was neglected by her mother. But the evidence to dismiss this shows that she had royal toys purchased, religious texts provided, and that she was religiously educated at a convent in Poissy. Right from a very early age it was discussed that Catherine should marry the then Prince of Wales, the son of Henry IV, but Henry IV died before any negotiations could begin. Then the then Prince and now King reopened the topic, and he asked for a very large dowry and an acknowledgement that he was the rightful heir to the throne of France. Catherine and Henry married in France at the parish church of St. John, and it's believed that Henry was enamoured with her and her beauty. They were married in the June of 1420, and then Catherine and Henry returned to England in the February of 1421. And then on the 23rd of the same month, Catherine was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey. Now Henry V and Catherine were only married for 2 years, but within that time they had a child together, who later went on to become King Henry VI. But Henry V never met this son, as he had returned to his military campaigns in the June of 1421. Henry VI was born in the December of 1421 and was doted on by his mother. His father stayed away and died just before his 36th birthday, when he became sick on the 31st of August 1422 during the siege of Meaux. So then Catherine became a dowager queen, and her son became Henry VI of England and English-occupied northern France. Now after the death of her husband, the late King of England, Catherine became a cause for concern. She was young and still very much a catch for marriage. These concerns were led by her brother-in-law, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, who was also the guardian of her son. You see, there had been rumours that Catherine was planning on marrying Edmund Beaufort, the Count of Mortain, who was her late husband's cousin. The Duke of Gloucester was strongly against the match, and as such, a bill was passed by Parliament in 1427-28 that stated that if Catherine was to remarry, that her new husband would forfeit his lands and possessions, but his children would not suffer punishment. That was if she married without the king's consent. Now, you also have to remember that at this point the king, her son, was only 6 years of age. Catherine was under a close watch. She lived within the king's household, and it's thought this was so that she could care for her young son, but also so that the councillors could keep a very close eye on her. But even with all the eyes watching, she then fell for a Welshman named Owen Tudor and entered into a relationship with him. Tudor had been in France in 1421 and was in the service of Henry V's steward, Walter Hungerford. It is believed that Owen Tudor was appointed the keeper of Catherine's wardrobe, and their relationship began during this period, and they both lived at Windsor Castle, and it was whilst she was here that she became pregnant with their first child. Now, it is important to note that at some point in the May of 1432, Owen Tudor was granted the rights of an Englishman by Parliament. You see, Henry IV had actually limited the rights held by a Welshman, so to have the rights of an Englishman was a huge step forward for Owen Tudor. And also, interestingly, there is no known date of the marriage between Catherine and Owen. But at the same time, there is no record that their marriage or the legitimacy of their children ever came into disrepute or questioned in the secular or canon law. So their marriage is believed to have been valid and lawful. The lawfulness and validity of their marriage also adds respect and stronger royal ties to the claims of the House of Tudor. Between Catherine and Owen, there were 6 children at least. We know of Edmund, Jasper, and Edward. These were all born away from court. And then there was Margaret. Margaret became a nun and is then thought to have died young. Catherine is then believed to have died relatively young in childbirth, or just after, on the 3rd of January 1437. And another key point to remember is that Catherine's cause of death is debated. Some say it was childbirth, but there are an equal number of records that state she died from some mysterious illness. It shows that she entered Bermondsey Abbey looking for a cure and prayer, and interestingly, Catherine made her will just 3 days before she passed away and died. Catherine was initially buried within the Old Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Now, after Catherine's death, her husband, Owen, was arrested for going against the lords of remarrying a Queen Dowager. He went before the council and was taken to Newgate Prison. He was then, in 1438, caught trying to escape, but in the summer of the same year, he was then taken to Windsor. Whilst this was happening, Catherine and Owen's 2 eldest sons were living with Catherine de la Pole, the Abbess of Barking, and then at some point in 1442, the half-brother, the king, took a more hands-on role in their upbringing. Owen Tudor was then eventually released on bail of £2,000 and was then eventually pardoned. He was treated well afterwards and became a member of the king's household, but he then died via execution in 1461 during the Battle of Mortimer's Cross by the Yorkists. The sons of Owen and Catherine were then given earldoms by the king, their half-brother, and it's through Edmund Tudor, who married Margaret Beaufort, and their son Henry Tudor, that the House of Tudor was then born. Now, if we go back to Catherine, she was just 35 when she died, and she was given a huge queen's funeral, despite the fact that she had remarried, and that her marriage to Owen Tudor caused a lot of scandal. After she died, she was embalmed, and her internal organs were removed to prevent decay, and the cavity was then stuffed with herbs and spices. As per the tradition at the time, her body was wrapped in cerecloth, a heavy material that was soaked in wax, and it was then encased in lead before it was placed inside of a wooden coffin. Her organs had been removed, and they were kept sometimes in separate jars and boxes, or sometimes they were also buried in other locations to the rest of her body. On top of her coffin was a huge wooden effigy that showed Catherine dressed in her clothes, and it was painted to look as realistic as possible, and it showed her as a very tall woman. She had blue-grey eyes, and following her first funeral, she was then given a second on the 8th of February 1437, just 5 days after her death. This was to lay her to rest in her alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, near to her royal husband, Henry V. Now, you would have thought that this would have been the end to her story. She'd been buried, she'd had a funeral. What more could possibly happen? But this certainly wasn't the case, and what happened to Catherine afterwards is barbaric and disgraceful. Her tomb, it's believed, could have been temporary, as her son, Henry VI, wanted to create a huge memorial for her, but he died before this could take place, and he had been occupied with the Wars of the Roses. Now, her grandson, Henry VII, then demolished the old Lady Chapel where Catherine was laid to rest, and he did draw up great plans to build a new one. But it was during the building works that Catherine's tomb was destroyed and her body was unearthed as they were digging the foundations for the new chapel. At this point, Catherine's coffin had been in the ground around 5 or 6 decades, and it had been decaying, and there was a lot of rot. Her remains were then taken out of the coffin from the inner lead coffin and were placed in a wooden chest lined with lead from the old roof of the chapel. They then lay this onto the floor near to her husband, and sadly, this is where she stayed for the next 300 years. It was a clear statement from Henry VII, a way of distancing himself from his relatives and possibly the scandal that surrounded the marriage of his grandparents. But he did say that Catherine should be buried alongside him, as she was an ancestor. He's noted as saying, "In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitor's and blood, and especially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry V. Our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried." You see, it seemed that he envisioned the Lady Chapel was a family tomb for all of the Tudors. But before the Lady Chapel could be finished, Henry VII died, and some of the instructions that had been left were not carried out. Henry VIII did not bury his great-grandmother Catherine of Valois. Edward VII didn't, Mary I didn't, and neither did Elizabeth I. The chest she was placed into had a lid which was in 2 parts, meaning that the lid could be lifted to show her remains when people wanted to see her. They would come to Westminster Abbey over the centuries and pull back the cerecloth showing her face and chest, all the way down her body. It was said that, the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather. People described her as having bare skin with no clothes, and it was considered she was buried naked, with no clothes except the shroud. Some tour guides inside the abbey made money from this, charging visitors a shilling to see her remains, and her body was a very popular tourist attraction. Many believed that she was a scorned lady who was being punished by being unburied, because she went against the wishes of her husband, the king, and gave birth to their heir at Windsor. Henry V allegedly heard a prophecy that stated that a prince born in Windsor would lose all rights to the kingdom, and Henry VII actually did this during the Wars of the Roses. Because of this, it was said that Catherine's body was left out, as one witness stated, "Sensible of her fault in disobeying her husband, it was her own desire and pleasure that her body should never be buried. If so, it is pity that the woman, especially a queen, should be here within, whose dust doth preach a sermon of duty and of mortality to all." But many people would flock to Westminster Abbey and would go further than just viewing the remains of the 15th century queen. They would touch them and mistreat her body. The London diarist Samuel Pepys once stated how he saw Catherine's body following watching Shakespeare's play of Henry VI. He said, "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth. Reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen. And this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." So people would flock to the abbey to kiss the corpse of the queen, and this became a tradition. But further would still take mistreatment of her remains, as during the 18th century it was written that she had been torn to pieces by a group of young scholars who amused themselves. When this writer witnessed the body, he said it was a shapeless mass of whitish colour and had been desecrated. Her remains were then placed inside of a vault in 1788, and here it lay for around 100 years. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, her vault was opened and people broke through to see if Catherine's body was really inside of the Villiers vault. They found her remains on top of a pile of coffins, and the wooden coffin she had been in had yet again gone rotten. It had stuck to another coffin, and although they managed to free it, when it came into the atmosphere, it fell to pieces. Her body was then inspected, and Catherine's remains had a number of pieces missing. It was said that they had been covered in lime, and several parts had been eaten away. The entire front part of her skull had gone, and one part of the back was found lying on her pelvis. Many of her backbones were missing, as were all of her ribs except for one, and 2 of her right arm bones had disappeared. Her clavia had been taken and replaced with a bone from her pelvis. So it seems souvenir hunters had raided her body and taken the remains of the former queen, but her legs were found in perfect condition. These remained protected by 12 layers of cerecloth and were preserved well with the skin still remaining. The coffin was finally replaced and her remains were placed in it. A witness who saw it being carried into the chapel said, "It was a striking and impressive scene which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hand one small lantern to light us, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, 'We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral.' Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains inside of the thick English oak coffin were marked by an inscription showing the bizarre journey that her remains had been on. They had built a new tomb near to the altar, and in Henry V's chapel her remains were laid to rest 400 years after her death. The inscription marked, 'It is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Requiescat in pace.' Catherine started her life as a French princess. She was married to an English king to unite the thrones of England and France, and she was then a wife, a queen, and a mother. And then after the death of Henry V, she was watched closely as to not break the rules of remarrying. But she found love in Owen Tudor, and together they had at least 6 children, one who went on to father the first Tudor king, Henry VII. It is interesting to note, however, that Catherine birthed one king, and then her grandson became the second of her line. She was a wonderful mother by all accounts. She doted on her children, until her death that is, and then after she died she suffered greatly, both at the hands of her descendants and then the public who just wanted a glimpse of the once queen who created a scandal with her love, a scandal that Henry VII distanced himself from, but he actually wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Catherine and Owen. She was a woman who was educated to a high standard of the time, and she lived for her children by all accounts. But the question I find myself asking is, why was she punished for being a woman who had a desire for love? But she was, or at least her husband was, punished for this after she died. Catherine of Valois was finally left to rest in peace around 400 years after she died, and throughout the centuries she had been placed into a temporary coffin above ground, and this chest had then been opened a number of times with gruesome and grisly antics happening to the remains of a Queen of England. She was an important medieval woman, and she deserved to be treated so much better than she was. The abuse she faced after death was uncalled for and criminal. But maybe that was just the time. At least now she can finally rest for eternity in the safety of her alabaster tomb. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.